Okay, guys. So we're going to be exploring the Gothic, exploring Gothic sublimity in Ann Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho today. And as I mentioned, this is related to my book, Theology in the Early British and Irish Gothic. So as you may imagine, there is going to be quite a lot of theological content today. If you're interested in my work, you're very welcome to contact me on social media at romgothsam or through the Romancing the Gothic email, sam@romancingthegothic.com. Nice and easy. Where are we going today? What's going to be happening? Well, there's quite a few sections. First of all, I'm going to speed run you through the Mysteries of Udolpho so that if you haven't read it, you're still going to have an idea of what I'm talking about. Then, quite simply, we're going to have a look at what is the Sublime. I feel that's a quite important question for a talk on the Sublime. The next section is where we're getting into a bit more detail. So we're going to look at theologies of the Sublime, or that tree looks a lot like God when you think about it. We're then going to go on to how Ann Radcliffe uses this sort of theology of the Sublime in a theoaesthetic buildings roman. Don't worry if that's not a clear phrase yet. Or Emily gets over her emo phase. The next one, we're looking at sublime subjectivity and gender, or girls aren't just pretty and useless, sounds fake. Followed by an exploration of the natural sublime and the ruins of a broken world, or fossils prove the flood. And finally, we'll be looking at the idea of sublime taste or villains hate views. So I had a lot of fun coming up with these titles, so don't be mean about them. So the Mysteries of Udolpho, the speedrun version. The great mystery of Udolpho, I think all of us can agree, is why does the heroine Emily marry Valancourt? But I don't have time to go into that today. So let me give you a speedrun through all of the actual book. We start off with a family idyll. Emily and her father, St. Aubert, and their mother in La Vallée in Gascony. And it's this sort of beautiful location, very idyllic. They're a happy family. Everything is perfect. It's all great. They're not super rich, but they're happy. Then the mum dies. So that goes badly. And then they go on an exceedingly long journey. Emily and her dad. They go through the trees, over the hills, and far away on this aesthetically pleasing journey through mountains and gorgeous scenery. While they are traveling, a suitor appears, the aforementioned Valancourt, who's prancing about dressed as a hunter, but he's not. He's just sort of on a scenic vacation, and he cries a lot, and he informs Emily how to look at the scenery and all of this kind of very romantic stuff. He disappears, and also her father dies, and so then Emily is left in a bit of a difficult situation. She's inherited La Vallée, but things aren't going to go particularly well for her here. She's not independent. First of all, she returns home, and there's a lot of instances where she thinks she perhaps sees her father. I think these are ambiguous. Other people think that he's not there. But there's a mystery unveiled because her father on dying has said, look, there's these letters, don't look at them, just burn them. And so she burns them. But first of all, she sees a part of a letter, and it unloads this mystery of who she is, because these look to be maybe love letters referring to some past tragedy. So are her family who she thinks they are? What's going on? Who knows? She then has to go and live with her aunt, Madame Charon, in Toulouse, she lives in this very rich household, and her aunt is very stuffy. She doesn't appreciate the scenery. She doesn't have the finer feelings that Emily does. But happily for Emily, Valancourt pops up again, and they get engaged. But then the villain, Montoni, really comes into the scene. He marries Madame Charon. She becomes Madame Montoni. And he decides that Emily can't marry Valancourt. He wants her to marry somebody else that will be of more benefit to him. And he decides that's all over, and he is taking her away with him and with her aunt to Italy. So they go on this jolly trip to Venice. Not very jolly, unfortunately, for Emily. You might be wondering what Valancourt's doing at this point. Well, he cries a lot in the garden and says, you know, if you loved me, you'd stay. And she doesn't reply. I think really quite impressively, well, if you loved me, you'd help me. So he stays behind, basically, and he's just kind of not in most of the rest of the novel. He's off stage. She goes to Venice, and Montoni tries to force her into marriage with one of his friends. But a falling out happens between them. Montoni takes her away unto his mountain retreat, the castle of Udolpho. There's some mystery surrounding it and what happened to the previous owner. And there's also a mystery about what does Montoni actually do there? Well, he leads a group of banditti. While she's there, she is under threat because not only is Montoni after her inheritance, he mistreats his wife dies, her money goes to Emily, and so he's after that inheritance as well. Also, the former suitor turns up and he wants to sort of kidnap her and get her away, and then she's in the horrible position of Montoni being her defender. And there's also the mystery of the Black Veil, the most rubbish mystery in all of Gothic history. There's a black veil that maybe points towards what happened to the previous owner, except it has nothing to do with that at all, and it's a bit of a dud of a mystery. I won't spoil it for you, though. You can have that experience yourself. So she spent all this time in Udolpho, and then she manages to escape with the help of a guy called Dupont, although he doesn't really help. The people who help are the two servants, Annette and Ludovico. And then we're not finished. People often think, oh, well, we're out with Udolpho. We're towards the end of the book. No, we're about halfway through. She ends up in the Chateau Leblanc, where she meets a new family. This house is partly ruined, partly kind of modern. And there's a mystery, as you might imagine, about the ruined part. There's ghosts that have been seen. Valancourt isn't here still, and Dupont wants to marry her, but she says, no, my heart belongs to Valancourt. Ludovico, the servant I mentioned, decides that he is going to help disperse the mystery of the ghosts. He doesn't help, though, because he goes and he stays in the haunted room and then he disappears. We'll come back to Ludovico later because he comes back up. At the point where she's in the chateau, she's now kind of embedded in this family. Valancourt reappears, but he comes with a bad bit of history. While she's been away, he has been in France, he's been in Paris, he's been living it up, he's been with loose women. He's also got into a massive amount of debt and got himself into prison. And Emily's like, well, no, I can't marry you because look at what's happened to you. Look at who you have become. So she ends up kind of going back to La Vallée, and also, you know, her friends come and visit her there. But this travel over the mountains doesn't go very well. They get captured by banditti, or they get kind of lured in by banditti. But don't worry, guys. Ludovico is there to the rescue, because these aren't just banditti. These are pirates who are using the Chateau Leblanc, pretending to be ghosts. And they're now in the mountains being banditti, and Ludovico is there and he rescues everybody, and everybody is safe and everything is great and everyone can get married to whoever they want to. And there is finally a reconciliation between Emily and Valancourt, because she learns he wasn't just in debt. He stayed in prison because he gave all of his money to some other guy to help him. And so they get married, they return to La Vallée, and everything is a happy ever after. So that's the speed run. You've got it in your minds now, hopefully. If anybody has noticed any discrepancies or wants to add any major plot points, do feel free in the chat. So what is the Sublime, and perhaps what does it have to do with the Mysteries of Udolpho? Well, there's a lot of critical discussion about the role of the Sublime in Mysteries of Udolpho, because Ann Radcliffe really leans into Sublime depiction. The word pops up about 100 times, and you know, that first 100 pages, it's just a trip through sublime landscapes. So it's a key part of the novel. But what is the Sublime? Now, there's lots of answers to this question. And what I want to do is not think about what we know the Sublime to be today, not thinking about theories from the 19th, the 20th, or the 21st centuries, but looking back at what it was at the time and what it was understood to be at the time. I also want to look at how is Radcliffe using it. So just a quick moment in the chat, actually. For you, if you're thinking of the Sublime, what is an image or a piece of work or a picture or an experience that says to you Sublime? Just pop it in the chat for me. I will pause the recording so that we can do this for a second. Okay, so a lot of those ideas are that kind of big mountain landscape, those big dramatic views. So let's see how Radcliffe uses it in her novel. So I'm going to give you 4 examples of how she uses the word sublime. And these are the first three times she uses it, and the last one is tying it in more to what people might expect. This is about Saint Aubert. He's wandering around in the twilight. He loved the soothing hour when the last tints of light die away, when the stars one by one tremble through ether and are reflected on the dark mirror of the waters. That hour which of all others inspired the mind with pensive tenderness and often elevates it to sublime contemplation. So this might not be exactly what we expect when we think of the sublime. It might be. There's some grandeur to it. It's this sort of twilight scene. But the idea of sublime contemplation is perhaps not what your mind might go to when you think of sublimity, especially if you've got Burke in the back of your mind. And we'll get back to Burke in a second. The second example of the use of the word sublime by Radcliffe: thought and cultivation are necessary equally to the happiness of a country and a city life. In the first, they prevent the uneasy sensations of indolence and afford a sublime pleasure in the taste they create for the beautiful and the grand. Again, perhaps a slightly unexpected use of the sublime. There's no mountains here. This is all about thought and cultivation and sublime pleasure. Okay, next one. The sublime emotions of pure devotion gradually elevated his views above this world and finally brought comfort to his heart. This is after the death of his wife. So again, not particularly tied to that sort of sense of the sublime of mountains and grandeur, but definitely seeing the theology part coming through here. Now, the last example is more what we immediately think about. After traversing these regions for many leagues, they began to descend toward Roussillon, and the features of beauty then mingled with the scene. Now, the travellers did not look back without some regret to the sublime objects they had quitted, though the eye, fatigued with the extension of its powers, was glad to repose on the verdure of woods and pastures that now hung on the margin of the river below. In other words, the sublime objects were those kind of stark mountain views behind them. The reason why I wanted to just give these four examples, though, is to show the ways in which the sublime is used are quite various. There's a number of different meanings, and it's certainly not all connected to sort of dramatic mountain views. So if we're seeing these examples, all quite different, we need to go back and think about what the sublime is and how it's acting and move away from a singular conception of the sublime, particularly at this time. Now, Martin Sheen noted in 1809 that of all the qualities of art, the sublime is that which appears to be the most vague, irregular, and undefined. Scarcely two writers are agreed as to its properties or powers. And that's true. There's basically hundreds of treatises and essays on the sublime in the 18th century. And Radcliffe would have had access to literally hundreds of opinions. So we can't pin it down to one concept of the sublime that she's connecting to or accessing. And we also can't contain our own understanding of the sublime down to one opinion, which is why I've put in the chat that link to other concepts of the sublime in the 18th century, which goes into a lot more detail than I have time for today. It's worth noting that the sublime isn't just about the natural world. There's a number of different forms of the sublime. The first is the rhetorical, connected to speech, and that is actually the original context for the sublime, or writing about the sublime. The first treatise on the sublime is a classical treatise by called Perihepsis by Longinus, and he is talking about the rhetorical sublime. There's also the natural sublime, what we might be more accustomed to, and also the moral sublime. And all of these come into play in Radcliffe's thinking. So I mentioned that the first text is that Perihepsis by Longinus. So what does he suggest the sublime is? What is distinctive about it? And remember, he is thinking actually about rhetoric here and speech, not necessarily about those natural views, but he's depicting what the emotions connected to the sublime are and what the experience of the sublime is. So he says that the sublime is grand and lofty, which the more we consider, the greater ideas we conceive of it, whose force we cannot possibly withstand, which immediately sinks deep and makes such impressions on the mind as cannot be easily worn out or effaced. The mind is naturally elevated by the true sublime, and so sensibly affected with its lively strokes that it swells in transport and inward pride. So what are these key emotions connected to the sublime? Well, there's feelings of elevation and greatness, of grandeur. It has an instantaneous and an irresistible effect, and its effect is primarily emotional. There's a permanent or semi-permanent impression connected to it, which is also connected to further contemplation. Ideas are conceived of from the sublime. It's not simply an emotional experience. You can attach this to the grand mountain view, that when you look out, you might feel, but you also have thoughts perhaps about infinity, eternity, your place in the world. It leads to contemplation and consideration. It also can lead to a sense of self-elevation, of transport and of transcendence, but also this sense of self-elevation through your own ability to connect to and be part of this sublime. Now, the most common version of the sublime that we talk about in Gothic studies is Edmund Burke's, found in his philosophical inquiry into the sublime and the beautiful. And the reason I didn't start with this is because it is only one concept, and it is a very partial concept of the sublime. I wanted to start with the Longinus to slightly divert us from what Burke is about to say. Burke's very famous definition is all about terror. He says, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. I say the strongest emotion because I am satisfied the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. I'm not going to deny that the terror sublime has its place in the Gothic. And as we're going to see, Emily experiences this terror sublime, this sense not only of awe or of wonder, but of fear almost in the face of the grandeur of the mountains, for example. However, Burke's idea of the sublime would have you reacting like this almost. And there's lots of critiques of this Burkean idea of terror as the root of the sublime, or as always the root of the sublime, or of any terror as the root of the sublime, in authors of the time, and specifically in Radcliffe herself. In her essay on the supernatural in poetry, she differentiates between terror and horror. Essentially, what she's doing is saying that Burke's claim that anything associated with terror is too broad. Terror isn't one thing. Everything that makes you afraid isn't terror. We need to differentiate between terror and horror, which is so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, and the other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. For Radcliffe, the sublime is connected with terror, not horror. But what's important about that connection is what makes terror important to the sublime sometimes for Radcliffe is this possibility of awakening the faculties to a high degree of life, of leading you towards contemplation and encounters with, as we'll see, the divine. I want you to remember that language that she used about horror, because it's going to come up here a little bit as well. Burke explores the natural sublime, saying that the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature, when those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all of its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, nor by consequence reason on that object which employs it. Hence arises the great power of the sublime, that far from being produced by them, it anticipates our reasonings and hurries us on by an irresistible force. Astonishment, as I have said, is the effect of the sublime in its highest degree. The inferior effects are admiration, reverence, and respect. So Radcliffe's sublime aligns with this in part and disagrees with it in part. You'll notice that overlap of language or idea, that idea of all the motions are suspended with some degree of horror. That's something that Radcliffe essentially rejects as a form of the sublime. What she's much more interested in is this emotional response, but also this connection to contemplation and to transcendence. So these emotions of astonishment, Admiration, reverence, and respect are very much a part of Radcliffe's Sublime, but she sees their connection to terror somewhat differently to Burke. For her as well, emotion does precipitate reasoning, but it doesn't remove reasoning. And terror isn't the only way to get to the sublime. Now, Edmund Burke's list of qualities of the natural world which lead to the sublime is helpful as an understanding of some of those aspects that Radcliffe is going to employ: power, vastness, infinity, magnitude, difficulty, obscurity, and loudness. I've got an image here of an avalanche, those mountain scenes, those waterfall cascades. Those excessive scenes are something that Radcliffe deploys as a mode of the sublime. It's not the only mode of the sublime, though. I want to keep coming back to that idea that Radcliffe is using the Burkean sublime, but not exclusively the Burkean sublime. I want to suggest that she particularly uses the work, or is influenced by the work, of two other earlier thinkers, John Dennis and Joseph Addison, both of whom depict the sublime as having multiple different forms that interact with each other. So John Dennis doesn't use the word sublime, but he's engaging with the Longinus. So he's using the Longinus text as the sort of root of his theory. But instead of referring to the sublime, he refers to enthusiastic passions. But he says there isn't simply one of terror. Instead, he says that there are multiple sublimes of admiration, terror, horror, joy, sadness, and desire. And if you think back to those quotes from Radcliffe at the beginning, you can see how there are multiple forms of the sublime in Radcliffe. She talks about sublime pleasures. She talks about sublime contemplation in the melancholy hours of twilight or after the death of St. Aubert's wife, for example. She also has a sublime of admiration, and yes, a sublime of terror, but not only terror. Joseph Addison wrote about the pleasures of the imagination. And often, these pleasures of the imagination he described as the grand, the uncommon, and the beautiful. Often in theorizations, you'll see the grand connected with the sublime, and there is clearly a connection. But as we're going to see, Joseph Addison draws on ideas of the sublime in all three of these categories, again, using the language and the ideas of Longinus. He gives an example of the grand. Such are the prospects of open champaign country, a vast uncultivated desert, huge heaps of mountains, high rocks and precipices, or a wide expanse of waters, where we're not struck with novelty or beauty, but with the rude kind of magnificence which appears in many of these stupendous works of nature. Our imagination loves to be filled with an object or to grasp at anything that is too big for its capacity. We're flung into pleasing astonishment, not terror, at such unbounded views, and feel a delightful stillness and amazement in the soul at the apprehension of them. So absolutely, Radcliffe uses this register of astonishment, stillness, and amazement in terms of relation to the grand. What about the uncommon? Well, for Addison, the uncommon, he says everything that's new or uncommon raises a pleasure in the imagination because it fills the soul with an agreeable surprise, gratifies its curiosity, gives it an idea of which it was not before possessed. Whatever is new or uncommon contributes a little to vary human life, divert our minds for a while with the strangeness of its appearance. It serves us for a kind of refreshment, and taken off from the society we are apt to complain of in our usual and ordinary entertainments. It is this that bestows charms on a monster and makes even the imperfections of nature please us. So I think at the end there, you can see how this might relate once again to the sublime. That sort of sense of astonishment can come from the uncommon as well. And we'll see, in the Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily is constantly facing different views, different worlds that she's never seen before. And they all lead to sublime experiences. The beautiful is perhaps easier to imagine for ourselves, but I want to sort of stress the way in which, for Burke, he differentiates between the sublime and the beautiful as two completely distinct categories. Radcliffe doesn't do that, Dennis doesn't do that, and Addison doesn't do that. Addison talks about the beautiful, saying that there's nothing that makes its way more directly to the soul than beauty, which immediately diffuses a secret satisfaction and complacency through the imagination, gives a finishing to anything that is great or uncommon. The very first discovery of it strikes the mind with an inward joy and spreads a cheerfulness and delight through all its faculties. So here I want to underline the ways in which the grand, the uncommon, and the beautiful can come together to produce a more profound effect, according to Addison. He says, we nowhere meet with a more glorious or pleasing show of nature than what appears in the heavens at the rising and the setting of the sun, which is wholly made up of those different stains of light that show themselves in clouds of a different situation. Now, why have I used this example? Because that kind of idea of a grand sunset is quite clearly something we might align with the sublime, especially if you're on top of a mountain looking at it. But he is here saying that it's something that is beautiful, and he's mixing together these ideas of the grand, the uncommon, and the beautiful to produce a sublime effect, but one that is rooted in joy and admiration and reverence. And that's certainly what we're going to see in Radcliffe. As he notes, the fancy delights in everything that is great, strange, or beautiful, and is still more pleased the more it finds of these perfections in the same object. Again, that mix of characteristics. So let's summarize. What is a sublime? Well, in all of the accounts that we've looked at, it's associated with specific feelings of awe, astonishment, wonder, ecstasy, amazement, transcendence, and exaltation. It's often connected with things like vastness, infinity, power, obscurity, and excess. But this isn't just about mountain views. It's about sunsets. It's about also sublime contemplation of divine truths, for example. It works through the emotions and its impact is instantaneous, but it's not completely separated from reason. It leads to contemplation and understanding. Burke associates it exclusively with terror, but other critics, including Radcliffe, highlight different forms of the sublime and push back against Burke's complete dichotomy of the beautiful and the sublime, and push back against his idea that terror is always the root of the sublime. John Dennis highlights multiple forms of the sublime, and Addison notes the ways different pleasures or aesthetics work together to create a sublime experience. So, having gone over all that, and I'm sure you're overwhelmed by awe in some way, possibly at how many words I can get out. Do you have any questions? There's a little question break with a beautiful mountain gif. So any questions, you can pop them in the chat. But if you don't have any, I can also continue. Okay, so we've had a brief look at some ideas of the sublime. So let's have a look at this idea of the theology of the sublime and how it might relate to Radcliffe. So theology of the sublime, or that tree looks a lot like God when you think about it. So one of the really influential theorists on my own work is Natasha Duquette, whose book Veiled Intent claims that women in the 18th century turned to veiling their incarnational biblical hermeneutics in a multiplicity of forms that are increasingly seen as acceptably feminine, including aesthetic theory. In other words, women encoded their contributions to theology in works like children's literature, Gothic literature, and aesthetic theory, because they were often removed from or banned from mainstream theological discourse at the time. When it says incarnational biblical hermeneutics, it means this kind of interaction with the Bible and faith that is not just rooted in theory and reason, but also in the body and in emotion. And that's very key, obviously, if we're thinking about the sublime. So there's lots of different ways that we can approach theologies of the sublime, but I'm going to be particularly concentrating on the natural sublime rather than those connections with the rhetorical sublime or the moral sublime yet. We'll go into the moral sublime later. If you want to ask me about those, I am very happy to have a chat about them. But the basic idea that we're going to look at is the idea that the natural sublime is connected to natural theology, and this idea of divine self-revelation in the natural world. In other words, that God reveals himself in the world around us. And there's many ways of thinking about what that revelation might entail. But I just want to show the ways in which this idea of natural theology connected to the natural sublime is a part of theological discourse and debate for millennia, essentially. although the term sublime isn't used, we are looking at what is essentially an aesthetic appreciation of the natural world being part of this discourse of natural theology. And it goes all the way back to the Bible. Romans 1:20, the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. In other words, the invisible things of God are reflected in the physical material world around us. Augustine, one of the church fathers, says that both heaven and earth and all things that are in them, behold, on every side cry out unto me that I should love thee. So the heaven and earth here isn't only reflecting the divine, it is pulling us towards the divine by reflecting his qualities, by reflecting the things that we should love, the idea of him as creator, sustainer, designer, but also we can find aspects of the divine personality in the natural world, Augustine is suggesting. Martin Luther, sort of architect of the Protestant Reformation, God has wrapped himself in the veil of his works. So that this sort of means that the natural world doesn't offer us a direct link to God. You don't look at a tree and see God. That was hyperbole in my title, but that it can point you towards the divine. Calvin, the architect of Calvinism, obviously, says that the rightest way and fittest order to seek God is to behold him in his works, by which he maketh himself near and familiar, and doth in a manner communicate himself unto us. Now me, what I say about this is that these accounts, all of these accounts represent a devotional practice, which is focused on emotional as well as rational access to divine truth through the natural world. In other words, our experience of the natural world, and this includes the sublime, is part of a practice where we seek God, not only rationally, not only through working out what we can reason to be true about God from the natural world, but it's also about what we feel in connection to the natural world. I thought I'd pop in a bit of David Fordyce because a lot of people know about Fordyce's sermons, and he also encapsulates a number of these aspects of how the natural sublime and the natural theology might connect together. The great artist of life and nature, who at once charms our sense by the wonderful apparatus and decorations of his work, he astonishes, that word is important, our imagination by the immense variety, infinite complication, and yet marvelous regularity of his machinery. He informs our reason by the simplicity and coherence of design which runs through the whole. And lastly, who interests and agitates every affection by the amazing subserviency of every single wheel and movement of the vast machine to strike and delight us. So you can see the echoes of sublime discourse in this discussion of natural theology. But let's dive into a little bit and pull this apart. What's it telling us? So the first part, the great artist of life charms our senses by the wonderful apparatus and decorations of his work. So it's pointing towards that emotional connection that we have, that physical reaction as well to the world around us that pulls us towards God by presumably reflecting him, as well as kind of showing him to be a creator. He astonishes our imaginations through variety and regularity. So this points towards God as a sustainer, but also towards a multiplicitous concept of God. So we're moving away from Burke's terror sublime, where there's only one sublime and therefore only one kind of version of God that comes with it, a God of wrath and judgment and power, but kind of missing out all of the love and the grace and the mercy part of him. It also points to a coherence of design. So that points towards God as designer, and it agitates every affection by the subserviency of every single wheel and movement of the vast machine to strike and delight us. So again, that concept of emotion, but we also have an idea here of providence, the way in which God is controlling the world and making it sort of work out the way he wishes it to. So what did Dennis and Addison, who we looked at before, say about the theoaesthetics of the sublime? What might Radcliffe be tapping into in her own understanding of the theoaesthetics of the sublime, or in other words, the theology of the sublime? Well, according to Dennis, nothing but God and what relates to God is worthy to move the soul of a great and wise man. And the natural sublime, or the wonders of the universe, show the attributes of the curator, of the creator, sorry. So the world points us towards God as creator, but also the reason the sublime moves us, the only reason it is able to move us, is because it reflects the divine and divine qualities. Whether or not you believe in the divine is what Dennis is saying. In Addison, he makes this connection with the natural world and God even clearer, saying his being passes through, actuates, and supports the whole frame of nature. His creation and every part of it is full of him. Thus, it is impossible to survey the world of fluid matter without thinking on the hand that first poured it out. In other words, that connection with nature through the sublime is always going to be inflected by some kind of theological consideration, contemplation, or realization. But also we have this idea of God not only as creator, not only as designer, not as a distant God, but as a sustainer whose nature is reflected in the world around us. Dennis and Addison also emphasize this idea of sublime taste, and that's something we're going to come back to later, or the ramifications of this we're going to come back to later in Radcliffe's work. But what do we mean by sublime taste? It's not simply a question of taste. It's also a theological factor. So Dennis says that God himself, who made the soul and best understands its nature, converts it by its passions. So in other words, God implants us with a sense of taste through which we can appreciate the sublime in order to lead us to him. Similarly, Addison has this idea that the supreme author of our being has so formed the soul of man that nothing but himself can be its last adequate and proper happiness. In other words, again, you have that inbuilt sense or taste or moral sense that the sublime appeals to draw us to God. In his 3 different pleasures of the imagination, the grand inspires us with a love of what reflects God's nature, his power and his majesty. The uncommon spurs our curiosity about the divine and the transcendent, and the beautiful makes the whole earth gay and delightful for our habitation, showing God's love and compassion. So theologies of the sublime, in talking about theologies of the sublime, the natural sublime can fulfill a number of different functions. It can be seen as reflecting God as creator, designer, or sustainer, or any combination of those 3, and or as revealing his character, and or as instrumental in deepening an effective relationship with God. And as we're going to see in Radcliffe, a number of those things are clearly true. From this early quote, we know that Emily loved these sublime walks through the wild woods and the mountains, where the silence and grandeur of solitude impressed a sacred awe upon her heart and lifted her thoughts to the God of heaven and earth. In other words, she has that experience of the natural sublime leading her to understand God, at the very least, as creator. In the second quote, we have a reference to Saint-Aubert. All nature seemed to have awakened from death into life, and the spirit of Saint-Aubert was renovated. His heart was full, he wept, and his thoughts ascended to the great creator. Again, pointing us to the creator, but also emphasizing that emotional access to the divine. So if we look at these lists, we definitely see the creator. We'll also, I will argue, see the designer and sustainer. And we can think about what it reveals of God's character, but we're going to go into more depth in that in a later section. So, overwhelmed by so much divine revelation, do you have any questions? Let me pause. Okay, so we've looked at the broad strokes. Let's have a look at some more detail. So, a theoaesthetic Bildungsroman, or Emily gets over her emo phase. So I've said that the sublime, but more broadly, aesthetic discourse is really important in the Mysteries of Udolpho. There are quite literally hundreds of pages dedicated to it. And I'm going to suggest that it forms really a core way of understanding the novel as a Bildungsroman, or in other words, a novel of development, of a young woman going from that kind of cusp of adulthood into her sort of fully developed adult character. I'm going to say that that Bildungsroman is reflected in the theological and aesthetic strategies of the text. In other words, we're going to see her development as a woman being echoed in the way in which she interacts with the natural world and understands it theologically and aesthetically. So a lot of commentary on the Mysteries of Udolpho has this idea that we go on a journey from here to here. We start off in the beautiful La Vallée. We end up in the kind of sublime mountains of Udolpho, which are all very dangerous. And then we go back to La Vallée, and it's beautiful, sublime, beautiful, or picturesque, sublime, beautiful. Elizabeth Bowles says very distinctly that we split the narrative into sections under the aegis of incompatible aesthetic categories. The picturesque and the Burkean sublime preside over contrasting realities of La Vallée and the castle of Udolpho. Now, of course, if you remember my speed run through the text, or if you've read it, you might be thinking, well, there's actually quite a lot of the book missing in this representation. Yes, and we'll go into that in a second. But let's have a look at that claim that these are incompatible aesthetic categories, the picturesque and the sublime. First of all, what is the picturesque? Well, there's not one answer to this, but it goes back to the theorization of a man called William Gilpin. In his essay on picturesque beauty, he starts by saying, disputes about beauty might perhaps be involved in less confusion if a distinction were established, which certainly exists, between such objects as are beautiful and such as are picturesque, between those which please the eye in their natural state and those which please from some quality capable of being illustrated in painting. So this might not answer your question, but let me explain why it does. Gilpin's theory of picturesque beauty is all about pictures and painting. It's about a mixed and balanced scene, which can be translated to the canvas. So although he's differentiating here between beautiful and picturesque, these aren't two completely distinct categories. The picturesque can contain the beautiful, but the picturesque is this specific category which thinks about a scene that looks good in a painting, which might include beautiful elements, but it also might include a rundown hovel, a very common feature of picturesque drawings. It might include elements of the sublime. It might include a broken mountain or a shadowy lake. So you might already have the answer to this question from the way I've described it, but are the sublime and the picturesque incompatible? No, essentially. That we may examine picturesque objects with more ease, Gilpin says, it may be useful to classify them into the sublime and the beautiful. So he's here suggesting that the sublime and the beautiful are two categories of the picturesque. In fact, this distinction is rather inaccurate, though. Sublimity alone cannot make an object picturesque. However grand the mountain or the rock may be, it has no claim to this epithet unless its form, its color, or its accompaniments have some degree of beauty. And the punctuation here is Gilpin's, not mine. Nothing can be more sublime than the ocean, but wholly unaccompanied, it has little of the picturesque. When we talk, therefore, of a sublime object, we always understand that it is also beautiful, and we call it sublime or beautiful only as the ideas of sublimity or of simple beauty prevail. Now, there's a lot going on here. So he said at the beginning that, the sublime and the beautiful are parts of the picturesque. That something that is only sublime, though, isn't picturesque. So they're not synonymous terms, but the picturesque can include the sublime as it can include beauty. But he also here moves away from Burke's distinction between sublimity and beauty, saying that these are always connected in some way, specifically in the picturesque. Now, I mentioned that all definitions of the picturesque aren't the same, but other key writers on the picturesque, such as Udolpho Price, also reiterate this idea that the picturesque and sublimity are not completely distinct categories, although they might represent this lack of distinction in different ways. So for Udolpho Price, the picturesque appears to hold a station between beauty and sublimity. So instead of sublimity being a part of the picturesque is sort of on a scale between beauty and sublimity, somewhere in the middle. This leads us on to the next question, though. Are the picturesque and the sublime theologically incompatible? No, not at all. Gilpin's concept of the picturesque is rooted for him as a minister in the theological, although it's not a major part of how he writes about the theory. But he says we might begin in moral style and consider the objects of nature in a higher light than merely as amusement. We might observe that a search after beauty should naturally lead the mind to the great origin of beauty. In other words, we're seeing this reiteration, this idea that the natural world leads us to God. He is self-revealed in the world. According to Robert Mayhew, the picturesque essentially becomes a set of procedures designed to visualize God's plan to a fallen humankind, a project in accord with Gilpin's didactic and religious ambitions, which aimed at salvation. What does it mean by a procedure designed to visualize God's plan? Well, this idea of the perfect balanced picture, that perfect harmonious landscape, that's what he's saying, Gilpin was suggesting, is this is sort of the divine view of the world, this divine harmony and balance. So we've gone over the fact that the picturesque and the sublime aren't actually completely separated, nor are they incompatible with each other. Now I want to sort of go back to the practicalities of Mysteries of Udolpho, in that we don't have this clear differentiation, scenes where it's only the picturesque, because you can't have only the picturesque. It's always got elements of the sublime or the beautiful, but we don't have scenes that are just sublime or just beautiful. And we don't have a simple movement from La Vallée to Udolpho to La Vallée. We've got a travel journal essentially going on. We start off in La Vallée in Gascony, and I've popped a picture of Gascony there for you. Then we travel through the Pyrenees, through the mountains and the Mediterranean coast, not on a journey of terror, but journey with her father, where she's enjoying the views and she meets the love of her life, Valancourt, inexplicable. Then she ends up with her aunt in the manicured gardens of Toulouse. But these manicured gardens, that's where the horror really starts, not in the ruins and the sublime landscapes, the terror sublime landscapes of Udolpho. She goes on a journey over the Alps full of fear and wonder, then to Venice, again, this kind of luxurious, decaying place for her, where it's all too bright, all too wealthy, all too rich. Then she goes to Udolpho and the Apennines, and much of that is sublime landscapes, but also picturesque. Then in the middle of that, she gets taken to a cottage to kind of get her out of the way for a little while. And it's beautiful. It's a gorgeous little cottage. After she leaves Udolpho, she goes to the Chateau Leblanc, which is this kind of mixed aesthetic, this part ruin, part modern house, and ends up in La Vallée after crossing some more mountains. So she's all over the place. She's moving through mixed landscapes. She's not going simply in one direction. She's not going from here to here. So what is happening? Well, this is where I get into this idea of a theoaesthetic Bildungsroman. She's not going in a straight line from one aesthetic to another. What that Bildungsroman or development is the way that she interacts with these landscapes and the way that she understands them, and through them, the divine. So the beginning of the novel, although it starts in La Vallée in this kind of beautiful, picturesque setting, starts with disharmony and distortion. Because Emily is in a period of time in her life where she is not emotionally regulated. A lot of the beginning of the novel is taken up by Saint-Aubert giving her great advice about how to kind of control her passions with reason or with sense, and how to blend those things together. And this kind of disharmony is illustrated in her love for the terror sublime. So if you remember that quote from earlier, she's in La Vallée, which people always talk about as picturesque or beautiful, but what she loves are the wild wood walks that skirted the mountain and the mountain's stupendous recesses. So what she looks for, how she likes to experience the sublime, is through this kind of awful terror sublime scenery, this Burkean sublime scenery. Now, what do I mean by a disharmony? It's not just about this love of the terror sublime. It's pointing us towards something else. And I'm going to go back to Dennis here, because Dennis talks about the essential disharmony of the world. He says that in the original kind of state in Eden, there were three faculties: the senses, the passions, and the reason. And in Eden, man's primitive state was one of complete harmony between these vital faculties. Man walked with God and was united to him. With man's fall, so the eating of the apple, the harmony of his intellectual and animal powers was miserably broken. So sense, and i.e. the bodily, the passions, the emotions, and reason were no longer in sync with each other. And we see that in Emily, who leans towards the passions, the emotions, these excesses of emotion, the terror sublime of awe and wonder. We see it in Valancourt, who leans towards the senses. He's often overtaken by his own senses. He ends up, drinking and getting lured into relationships with other women. Dennis suggests that the sublime is one way of reharmonizing, that it can create passion in such a manner as to turn and incline the soul to its primitive object, and in doing so create a situation where reason and passion are on the same side. So that's not where Emily is at the beginning of the novel. Her love of the sublime is all about the terror sublime. It's all about these dramatic, overpowering scenes. And it's not leading her to this idea of the multiplicity of the divine or the different aspects of the divine. Reason and passion are not working together completely yet. And it's the work of the novel to get her to that state of harmony. So, as I said, she is not at the beginning of the novel engaging with divine multiplicity or that variety of enthusiastic passions of joy, of admiration, as well as terror, for example. And through the novel, she goes through multiple trials where she is refined by fire in many ways. So she has that early preference for the terror sublime, which points to emotional and spiritual imbalance. And it leads her to being emotionally overwhelmed multiple times. When she gets to Udolpho, she experiences more terrors than her reason can justify. Her passions or emotions and her reason are not in harmony. She must learn to differentiate between the profane sublime and the true sublimes. So she must stop thinking of the terror sublime as the only sublime and move towards that understanding of divine multiplicity. She must also learn to resist the lure of beauty. She's going well, she's learning all of her lessons, she's developing, she's harmonizing, and then she goes to this bower, this beautiful bower. And as Alison Milbank points out, it's another trap because it looks like a place of safety, but it's false safety. She's still under threat. And this idea of this only beautiful place where everything is soft and lovely, it's a trap for her in the sort of narrative of the book, but it's also a theological trap because it occludes the God of wrath. It does the opposite of Burke. It keeps all of the mercy and the kindness and the love and the beauty, but it gets rid of the God of wrath and this idea that we are in a post-lapsarian world where this is a world after the fall from Eden. The return to La Vallée at the end isn't a journey back to the place that she started off at. Geographically, yes, but the location might be the same, but Emily herself has changed. At the beginning, she stuck to the wildwood walks. At the end, there's no mention of that. She walks around the whole of the landscape and appreciates it on multiple levels. She goes back and finds memories there, and she connects with her past, but also her future. And it's there that she starts her career of active benevolence, because now, having gone through all these trials, all these landscapes, all these horrors and terrors and changes, she has come to appreciate its multiplicity. She's come to step away from that preference for the terror sublime. She's harmonized the passion and the reasons, and that is reflected in her understanding of divine multiplicity and sublime multiplicity. We have a whole new Emily. Throughout the course of the book, as I say in my book, Emily must learn to experience the sublime and find the divine in both the ordinary and the extraordinary of the natural world, and find the many faces of God in the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublimes of terror, admiration, joy, and peace. She must encounter in the face of nature not only the great creator, but also the benevolent God who designed innocent pleasures to be the sunshine of our lives, a present God, and the being who has protected and comforted us in every danger. And those last descriptions all come from her father before he dies. And it's sort of the work of the novel for her to get to the same place as him. So, the theoaesthetic Bildungsroman has hopefully been explained. Little gif. Catherine was never without a Radcliffe question. Be like Catherine. Did anybody have any questions? I'll just pause quickly. Okay, so Sublime subjectivity and gender is the next topic, and thinking about how the sublime here connects to the idea of Emily as a woman and Ann Radcliffe as a female writer. The the title, the secondary title, Girls Aren't Just Pretty and Useless, sounds fake. So it certainly sounded fake to Burke, as we're going to see. So here I mentioned that there's also the moral sublime, and this is where I'm getting into the moral sublime with you a little bit. Burke by name, Burke by nature, differentiates between sublime virtues and beautiful virtues. And I've coded them with colors as well, guys, just to make it super clear. Fortitude, justice, and wisdom are connected with men, and amiability, easiness of temper, kindness, compassion, and liberality with women. And this isn't just me being like, oh, these are really gendered terms. This is, he says this in his book. Fortitude, justice, and wisdom, male characteristics, amiability, easiness of temper, kindness, compassion, and liberality. Those are women things. He also notes that sublime virtues lead to admiration, but beautiful virtues lead to love, which, he also notes, approaches much nearer to contempt than is commonly imagined. He's so close to having a little feminist realization there. There's lots of critiques of this in both kind of contemporary writing and also in our modern kind of overviews of Burke. I wanted to point you to one that is happening at a fairly similar time to Radcliffe. So you're getting an idea of the discourse that is around at the time. Not suggesting that Radcliffe read this before she wrote her book, because, you know, very unlikely. But it's giving you an idea of these counter arguments. So Mary Wollstonecraft is specifically speaking to Burke in The Vindication of the Rights of Man. And she says, in relation to this idea of moral and moral sublime, beautiful, and sublime virtues, she says, you may have convinced them, i.e. women, that littleness and weakness are the very essence of beauty, and that the supreme being in giving women beauty in the most supereminent degree seemed to command them by powerful voice of nature not to cultivate the moral virtues that might chance to excite respect and interfere with the pleasing sensations they were created to inspire. Nature, by making women little, smooth, delicate, fair creatures, never designed that they should exercise their reason to acquire the virtues that produce opposite, if not contradictory, feelings. The affection they excite to be uniform and perfect should not be tinctured with respect, which moral virtues inspire, lest pain should be blended with pleasure, and admiration disturb the soft intimacy of love. So she's really laying into Burke here, this idea that some virtues are only for women. She says it's a way of infantilizing and containing women, and it is a way of maintaining that contempt for them as well. So how does Ann Radcliffe deal with this dichotomy? Is she more in the Wollstonecraft direction or more in the Burke direction? Much more in the Wollstonecraft direction, although I'm absolutely not saying that she would have agreed with Wollstonecraft on a lot of things. But the way that she does this is through fiction. And the kind of primary thing that happens is that she gives those beautiful virtues to her male characters. I love the fact that she uses amiable over and over again to refer to them. So she refers to Valancourt as amiable and unfortunate, and all the young men that appear as romantic interests in this book are amiable. Compassion and liberality, she also explicitly connects with Valancourt, who is always throwing his money around and giving it away to other people, not reasoning it through, just feeling a bit sad for people and giving them all his money. We also have this emphasis on sensibility, both for women and for men in the book, but male sensibility is a really big part of the characterization of characters like Valancourt, emotional sensitivity and sensibility. And so she is saying that that's not a female discourse. She is putting that onto men as well. And on the other side of that, those moral virtues, those moral sublime virtues, she gives to females in this text as well as men. So Emily's fortitude, justice, and wisdom is continually underlined. And so Emily makes a claim fictionally here to not a beautiful objectivity, where she is the beautiful object of somebody else's desire, but rather to a sublime subjectivity. And she does this in multiple ways. One of them is the way in which she rejects Valancourt when he returns to her life. So she rejects him for quite a long period of time. because she refuses to be the beautiful object of his desire. Instead, she has learnt and she's acquired fortitude and justice and wisdom and autonomy and independence, and she retains them until he can prove that he lives up to her standards. I would also say that what we see in Radcliffe is this attempt to create a degendered Christian subject. So sensibility is extended to men, and what is seen as sort of the virtues of sensibility for women, such as emotional receptivity and compassion, are exported onto the male characters. And it's taking on this idea, this biblical idea, that there is no longer male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So she's not going against sort of biblical thought necessarily, but she's aligning herself with this kind of description by Joseph Addison of the man of faith. But here she applies it to her female lead character, Emily. He or she has his light and support within him that are able to cheer his mind and bear him up in the midst of all those horrors which encompass him. He knows that his helper is at hand and is always nearer to him than anything else can be, which is capable of annoying or terrifying him. In the midst of calumny or contempt, he attends to that being who whispers better things within his soul and whom he looks upon as his defender, his glory, and the lifter of his head. That 100% is a description of Emily in the text, who comes to be able to bear up on her own, to express the fortitude necessary to survive, but also to thrive through the course of the novel. I also want to draw the attention to another theory put forward by Emma Cleary, which is the way that Emily and Radcliffe, through her, claim the sublime as female creators as well. So Emily appreciates the sublime. That's the first step. At the beginning, Valancourt's explaining it to her, but she doesn't really need that. And she later takes on the role of educator with Blanche particularly. And she is able to appreciate these views, appreciate this natural sublime, contemplate the divinity through it all on her own. But not only that, she also deploys the sublime. She claims it as her own aesthetic by using it in her poetry. And through her, Radcliffe is doing the same. So, though you may wish to flee as Emily fled, do you have any questions about this idea connected to moral sublimity and gender? So, this is the fossil bit I promised everybody. The natural sublime and the ruins of a broken world, or fossils prove the flood. I want to go into some of the little details of what Radcliffe does with the natural sublime, because I don't want you to go away just thinking, oh, the natural world reflects God. That's an overly simplistic version of the kind of intricacy with which Radcliffe engages with these theologies. When I say that the natural sublime or the ruins of a broken world, what am I talking about? Well, first of all, I'm referring to the way in which, in the Mysteries of Udolpho, Radcliffe over and over and over again uses this language of broken when she's talking about mountains in these sublime landscapes. So, these crags rose over, others of stupendous height and fantastic shape, some shooting into cones, others impending far over their base in huge masses of granite, along whose broken ridges was often lodged a weight of snow, that trembling even to the vibration of a sound threatened to bear destruction in its course to the vale. Another one, from a little eminence she looked back upon Toulouse and the far-seen plains of Gascony, beyond which the broken summits of the Pyrenees appeared on the distant horizon. So she keeps using this language of broken, and not just here, but multiple times throughout the text. Now, where is this idea of broken mountains coming from? Well, we can connect it back to a guy called Thomas Burnet in the 17th century and his sacred theory of the earth, where he offers a theory of sorts, an imagined theory about why we have mountains. And you can kind of see on the images that we have different sort of versions of the world, and they point us towards perhaps some of how he explains the seas and the mountains. But what he says is we have still the broken materials of the first world and walk upon its ruins. While it stood, there was the seat of paradise and the scenes of the golden age. When it fell, it made the deluge, and the unshapen earth we now inhabit is the form it was found in when the waters had retired and the dry land appeared. So what's his theory? In other words, when the world was made by God, it was perfect. And then the fall happened and humans ruined everything. And for him, the world got fundamentally affected by the flood. So his theory, he goes into quite a lot of detail, and I've read it for you so you don't have to, where he talks about how could it rain that much, and then where would the water go if everything of all the mountains were covered all over the world? Okay, how would that work? That doesn't feel like it would work. But basically, what he decides is that the original world had an outer core and then a water layer and then an inner core. And that what happened when the flood happened is that outer core kind of broke up and the water came up, not down. And so the mountains are that broken outer layer, essentially. So yeah, it makes complete sense, guys, if you don't have to use any science to work it out. So this idea, you might think my link with broken is a little bit tenuous, but this idea is specifically mentioned in the text when a couple of the other characters who've remained nameless so far, we don't really need to know their names. Some of the characters, not Emily, but her friends, are walking through these mountain scenes that the girl Blanche is a bit scared. And so Baron Saint-Foy starts to talk about the natural history of the scene among which they wandered. He spoke of the mineral and fossil substances found in the depths of these mountains, the veins of marble and granite with which they abounded, the strata of shells discovered near their summits, many thousand fathom above the level of the sea, and at a vast distance from its present shore, of the tremendous chasms and caverns of the rocks, the grotesque form of the mountains, and the various phenomena that seem to stamp upon the world the history of the deluge. So in other words, the Alps are the result of the flood, is what he's saying. And the fossils, they were in the sea, but now they're in the mountains because the world is broken. That's how it all happens. But you might think, okay, that's a fun little fact, Sam. What does it matter? Does it have any other theological importance? Well, it does, because it takes us back to the question of the Lord's controversy. And I'll go into what the Lord's controversy is, but the basic question underneath it that affects us and our understanding of that connection between the natural sublime and the natural theology is, how does the natural world reflect the divine? As soon as we start to think of the world as broken and not that kind of perfect world originally created, it becomes a little bit unclear. It might reflect God as creator, but also perhaps as judge. If we're saying that it reflects God's nature, how can it accurately reflect God's nature when it's broken or when it's corrupt? The Lord's controversy, as laid out by Marjorie Nicholson, is this idea of whether Adam and Eve found themselves in a world topographically much like our own, or whether due to man's fall there are blemishes on nature which are ultimately attributable to human depravity. In other words, is this the world that we inherited, that was made originally, or is it fundamentally different? And in Thomas Burnet's theory, it's fundamentally different. And Radcliffe, using that theory, suggests that she also views the world as fundamentally different from when it completely and perfectly reflected the divine. So the Lord's controversy leads us towards these fundamental questions. Is the earth, as Augustine notes, essentially good, or as Luther suggests, essentially corrupt? Radcliffe is really suspicious of this idea of the world as essentially good or wholly good. She's very suspicious of Rousseau. Although she uses Rousseauian ideas, she's suspicious of that idea of the innate innocence of the natural world. And she actually connects it with libertine philosophies. And this kind of libertine in Romance of the Forest, libertine uncle who's kind of using it to excuse the fact that he wants to sort of rape people. He's like, well, that's what happens in nature, isn't it? And so she's very suspicious of that idea of the innocence of the natural world. And she certainly engages with Burnet's theory. Elsewhere, though, she doesn't seem to completely align with Burnet, giving other options. So in the Romance of the Forest, she engages with the work of somebody called John Ray, whose book, The Wisdom of God, argued that the mountains aren't simply a heap of rubbish and ruins, but were designed by God for specific purposes. And she seems to kind of use that theory as well. So she's not perhaps completely aligned with a Burnetian idea or this idea that the world is essentially corrupt. For me, I think she's reflecting a middle ground. The earth, so soon as it was accursed, was brought her natural beauty into miserable filthiness and deformity, perhaps not with such strong language, and to a lamentable state, and that afterwards it was spoiled in many places through the flood. Yet notwithstanding, I say that it is the same earth which was created at the beginning. So that's a Calvinistic view. And we'll see in the next section that she aligns with Calvin and some other things. But this idea that the world that we live in can reflect God to some extent, but there's also that possibility, as we've already seen, for deformity and distortion, especially if we're not aware or engaging with divine multiplicity. So much controversy. Does anybody have any questions about that, if anything was unclear? We'll pause one more time and then we're into the last section. So the last part, sublime taste. Now, I mentioned that we'd be going back to that. Or villains hate views. I also mentioned that we'd be going back to Calvin, so bear that in mind. So in Radcliffe's theoaesthetic world, she engages with the sublime and its emotional impact on people. But there are three types of sublime laid out by Andrew Chignall and Matthew Holtman in relation to religion. Conversional, where somebody is converted to a theistic belief by a sublime experience. Corroborative, where a sublime experience just corroborates what you already believe. Or transformative, where it doesn't change your fundamental beliefs, but it might transform aspects of your practice, ways that you understand something. Now, in Radcliffe's book, there is a corroborative sublime. That quote that I keep using when she's wandering around the wild woods, she does it all the time. And every time she does it, it lifts her thoughts to the God of heaven and earth. So it's just corroborating and confirming that sense of God as creator over and over and over again. There is also a transformational sublime or transformative sublime in Radcliffe. And this refers to the character Blanche, who is this sort of younger version of a Gothic heroine that appears at the Chateau Leblanc. And she has spent her whole life in a convent, and she comes out and she's like, oh my God, the scenery is beautiful. It's sublime. It's magnificent. And she says, her response on seeing this kind of sublime landscape is, how can the poor nuns and friars feel the full fervor of devotion if they've never seen the sun rise or set? Never till this evening did I know what true devotion is. So here, she's not changing her fundamental beliefs, but she is having a transformative experience. What about the conversional sublime in Radcliffe? We don't have it. Villains hate views. Always. In Radcliffe's world. Isabel Rivers points the way in which that sense of the idea of the moral sense or the sublime sense that we find in Addison and Dennis, for example, they can become dangerously deterministic, because the idea that you're born with this moral sense and this ability to appreciate the sublime means that other people are born without it, meaning they don't really have the same chance as you to encounter God either emotionally or rationally through the natural world. And this leads in real life to real life predetermination. In the narrative, in the book, it leads to narrative predetermination. Our villains stay villains. In Radcliffe, no villain, no fallen woman, no insensate servant is ever converted by the sublime, because they can't be. A taste for the sublime and a sensitivity toward the divine self-revelation occurring in nature becomes, in Radcliffe, a gift bestowed by God to strengthen and confirm those who already have access to the deity, not to save or convince those who do not, and ultimately cannot have access to God. So in other words, the slightly darker side of Radcliffe's sublime is that it reflects a form of kind of Calvinistic predetermination, that those who don't have it will never be converted by the sublime. They cannot have that access to the divine. And yes, it acts as a way of encoding for the reader, oh, this person's a baddie. But when you take that step back and look at it through that theological lens, it's a little bit grim. And this idea of predetermination is also reinforced by her morals at the end of the books, which talk about the punishment of the guilty and how God works all things for the good of those who love him, essentially. That's the biblical quote, but that is the moral of these stories. These villains, guys, they don't stand a chance. And that's the sort of dark underbelly of Radcliffe's Sublime. So, any questions for me? I have one for you. Do you like the view, or is your soul in risk? There you go. That's it, guys.